Hello, my name is Alan.paic from the OECD Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation, and I will talk to you today about mining in the digital era. So the presentation has four parts. The first one will be about data versus minerals. What is similar, what is different between data and minerals. Then I will talk something about the balance of benefits and risks in data sharing. And a third part is about data access and data sharing in the current pandemic. And finally, we will say something about the North-South divide and the CARE principle. Data is a new factor of production, and you know this. This is something which is similar to minerals. We do have a huge quantity of data which is being produced now every day with exponential increase every year, and we can then use the data analytics and software to transform that data into knowledge and innovation. And this is then transformed into value added and productivity gains. And this is very much similar to what happens to mineral ore, which is mined and then transformed into value added products and services in the economy. Now, what are the differences? The differences mostly are, the aspect of data as a public good versus minerals as a private good. Okay, so data is non-rivalrous. I can use the data and I can benefit from the data, but that does not mean less data for someone else. Okay, so we can share data almost indefinitely, and there will always still be the same quantity of data left, which is different from the minerals. And also reuse is very important, and providing access to data is very important, and it actually maximizes the value, because the more people reuse the data, the more value they can extract from it, the more value the data actually has itself. Now, data is non-rivalrous, but it is excludable. Okay, so if I need exclusivity and if I need to protect some data because of confidentiality, because of privacy, because of intellectual property or something else, I can of course deny access to data, and in some cases this is necessary, but in most cases it is better to provide access to data. Data is also capital with increasing returns. As I said, data can be reused as input for further production. Data linkages between different types of data sets from different disciplines can give so-called super additive insights when we connect knowledge from different sectors together. Then we can get actually very, very rich insights. And this is seen in science in particular, when you do interdisciplinary. If you do climate, for instance, climate science is such an interdisciplinary where you have to combine, thermodynamics and chemistry and fluids, dynamics, and so on, and you have to actually put all these things together to understand climate. Data does not have any intrinsic value as in itself, but it creates value as it is used, and the use of data is needed. You need skills and you need software to be able to use data and produce value from data. Now, the difference between data mining versus mineral mining. As we said, data cannot be depleted. Mining will deplete in the end the mineral source. The marginal transport and dissemination costs are mostly very low in data mining. Okay, transport by internet and so on, bandwidth is getting cheaper and cheaper. With an exception, the cost for anonymization. If you need to render some data anonymous, this can be relatively high. Data collection and storage, fixed costs can be also quite high depending on the complexity of the data collection process. Storage over long periods of time is also very costly. And business models are difficult to construct because there are expectations that data should be available free of charge. And there are high fixed costs to as I said, collect and store the data. And last but not least, there are copyright issues. For instance, if you use text and data mining as a discipline where you put your algorithm, goes and analyzes, available text. Some countries' copyright laws will require that you actually pay copyright royalties for the mere access to the text, and of course that makes it impractical and creates a huge barrier. So exceptions to this are very important, and other speakers will address this issue. Now, the North-South divide, you have the notion of data sovereignty and ownership, which is not always respected, and one of the examples is the data from the Ebola outbreak, which has been moved to the global north and basically the global south, where the outbreak happened, has lost the sovereignty over it. And this is something which is not acceptable. Data is considered a public good, so it is expected to be free of charge. While the products developed on the basis of that data, such as a vaccine, is not public good, and this will be charged for. So there is some asymmetry here. And in the avian flu situation, Indonesia stopped sharing the virus samples because it was concerned that it would have to pay high prices for vaccines, and the WHO then responded by boosting vaccine production in emerging countries. And it's worthy to note that the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol actually recognize the country's sovereignty over genetic resources, and that there is no legal obligation to share, even in a health emergency. But we will see in the COVID example that this is, of course, a huge boost to the science, and that such sharing is, of course, desirable. Now, our second part is about the balancing of benefits and risks of data sharing. The OECD work, you have here a list of 6 OECD legal instruments in the area of data, and starting with in 1980, 40 years ago, a first instrument on protection of privacy and transporter flows of personal data. 2006, we had the recommendation concerning access to research data from public funding, with the principle that the research data should be as open as possible. And this is a recommendation we're working on right now to update, and when there will be a 2020 version of that recommendation. Then there are other recommendations, such as the public sector information, which is about open government data, and then there are very specific sectoral recommendations on human biobanks, genetic research databases, digital government strategies, and health data governance. Now, of course, the OECD is not the only one working on this, and on the right-hand side, you have several initiatives from the European Commission. Then you have the FAIR principles, which is CODATA is very active promoting those FAIR principles for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. You have International Open Data Charter. You have science clouds, which are being established across the world. You have Research Data Alliance recommendations, and many other initiatives. The recommendation concerning access to research data from public funding has a certain number of principles. This is the 2006 recommendation. And you can see these principles are very clearly are noted, and they're still, most of them are still very relevant. We're nevertheless working on updating those principles, and even though these are still valid, we want to now in the 2020 version make it even more. So the challenges we have found in this work are that there are seven challenges. The first one is about data governance for trust. So you need to make this balance between benefits and risks and risk management to enhance trust with your stakeholders. Then you have the second one, which is about discoverability, findability, machine readability, data standards. It's very much the FAIR principle I mentioned before. There is also the issue of recognition and reward system for data authors. Data authors must feel that they're not being robbed of their data, that actually if they share the data, they will be recognized and rewarded, which is not always the case. Then there is the definition of responsibility and ownership. This is mostly about how to protect intellectual property, how to manage especially public-private partnerships where the interests and legitimate concerns of both public and private parties have to be addressed. The business models for open data provision, as I said, it's not always easy to find a good business model, and the human and institutional capabilities which are needed to address the data and to store and curate the data. Finally, there is the exchange of sensitive data across borders, especially when we're talking about personal data or data which whose privacy has to be protected. These protocols are yet to be established, and very often it is very difficult to access such data across. So the first principle is about balancing the benefits and of sharing against privacy and confidentiality. On the one hand, you have high potential for economic and social benefit. You have new scientific discoveries. You have the reproducibility of scientific results, cross-disciplinary cooperation, economic growth through better innovation, societal challenges which can be tackled. You can increase also the resource efficiency, and so on. So there are huge benefits. At the same time, there are big risks about privacy, intellectual property, potential for malevolent use of data, national security concerns, and protection of endangered species. And this balance is similar to what is encountered in minerals extraction. There are huge economic and societal benefits to be balanced with environmental. And as an illustration, the Australian government actually has a lot of experience with such risk-benefit balances in the mining industry, and they have created policies to enhance this trust. And it's interesting to see what they did is that there is a consumer data right which gives Australians access to and control over their data to enable them to get a better deal from their bank, energy, and telecommunications companies. So they have the right. They have the right to know basically where their data is used and how it is used. And in the case of breaches, also they have the right to know that there was a breach. There's a National Data Commissioner whose task it is to manage the integrity and improve the Australian government management of data. There is a National Data Advisory Council, which is providing advice on ethical data use, technical best practice, and industry developments. And finally, there's the Data Sharing and Release Act, which improves the use and reuse of data while strengthening security and privacy protection for personal and sensitive data. The idea is to say that if we can explain to people how we're managing the data, how we're managing the risks, not trying to minimize the risk always exists, but to explain that we're minimizing that risk and managing. An example of the current pandemic and how important data access is to actually advancing the fight against the virus. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a Wellcome Trust initiative which was called Sharing Research Data and Findings Relevant to the Novel Coronavirus Outbreak. And this was signed by 117 organizations, including journals and funders. And basically they committed to immediate open access for peer-reviewed publications for the duration of the outbreak, and making the research available via the preprint servers, and sharing the results immediately with the World Health Organization. In April, we have the Open COVID Pledge, which goes even further. And here we have a large number of private companies providing intellectual property free of charge under the Open COVID license. And another big initiative is the COVID Open Research Dataset, where 57,000 entries, including 41,000 full-text machine-readable articles, are available for free without these barriers which I mentioned before for data mining. Online collaborative platforms have been established, a large number of them. I won't go through all of these, but you can browse them later. Basically, these are different platforms which enable the researchers to get in touch, to have access to the relevant data and the relevant software, and be able to exchange ideas and publications. And this is a real boost to open science and online collaboration across the world. The remaining challenges, there are of course still some challenges, and data is not necessarily always findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Sometimes it needs to be searched for and is not in very user-friendly formats. The sources tend to be dispersed, and there's curation, which is operated on the fly and not always of the best quality. The access to personal health record sharing is also not ideal. It should be, of course, always available pending the patient's consent, but this is yet to be passed as legislation in many OECD countries. Access across borders is even more difficult, and the Vodan network is proposing to create fair data repositories where you could have incoming algorithms, virtual machines, to ask specific research questions. And finally, the standards for COVID-19 data need to be established so that data would be really interoperable. The way forward is to develop relevant data governance models which allow for open research data by default, providing also regulatory frameworks which would enable interoperability within the networks of large electronic health records providers, working together to develop and clarify a governance framework for the trusted reuse of privately held research data, clarifying the incentives and rewards for researchers, require immediate disclosure of data, software and protocols, secure adequate infrastructure, including data and software repositories, computational infrastructure, and digital collaboration platforms, ensure adequate human capital and institutional capabilities are in place to manage, create, curate, and reuse research data. And finally, enable access to sensitive research data across borders on a more restricted basis in secure environments. And finally, talking about the North-South divide, the CARE principle. As I mentioned before, there are issues about data sovereignty, and that's why it has been proposed to have a complementary set of principles. There are the FAIR principles, which I already mentioned before, the findable, accessible, and interoperable, and reusable. They should apply to all data. And a complementary set of principle is about, it's called CARE, and the C stands for collective benefit, A stands for authority to control, R stands for responsibility, and E stands for ethics. So let's see what is meant here. So the collective benefit, or the C, means that data ecosystems should be designed and function in ways that enable indigenous people to derive a benefit from the data for their inclusive development and innovation, for the improved governance and citizen engagement, and for equitable incomes. So that is the collective benefit in favor of the indigenous people. Then there is the A, like authority to control. This is meant to protect indigenous people's rights and interests in indigenous data, which must be recognized, and their authority to control such data to be empowered. And I guess, you know, I'm not a minerals expert, but I guess many of these issues are similar to what you can see in minerals, right? Because you also have this idea that indigenous people want to be able to have sovereignty over their mineral deposits, and the same occurs with data. So here we want to recognize the rights and interests of indigenous people. We want to recognize the data for governance, and having their cultural governance protocols, and be active leaders on the stewardship and access to indigenous data. R of the CARE principles is the responsibility. For those working with indigenous data, to have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. Accountability requires meaningful and openly available evidence of these efforts and benefits. So there should be positive relationships. Indigenous data are unviable unless they're linked to relationship built on respect, reciprocity, trust, and mutual understanding. We should use it also for expanding capability and capacity, and to protect indigenous languages and worldviews. And finally, ethics, last but not least, you know, ethics is about indigenous people's right and well-being, which should be the primary concern, to minimize harm and maximize benefit, for justice, you know, in order to address imbalances in power, resources, and how these affect the expression of indigenous rights and human rights. And finally, the data governance should take into account the potential future use and future harm based on ethical frameworks grounded in the values and principles of the relevant indigenous community. And this brings me to the conclusion. The differences between data and minerals. Data is non-rivalrous. More data for me means you can have also more data. Sharing increases value. The more I share the data, the better it is for everyone. And restricting to the access to data reduces actually the value of you can extract from the data. Similarities, it's a high risk, high return business, both in minerals and data. You can create huge economic benefits using data or using minerals, but you have high risk, and the risks are different, but there are high risks in both data and minerals. In data, it's about privacy, it's about it could be even national security, it could be intellectual property. In minerals, it will be mostly the environment. The need to involve the stakeholders, that's the same, because you need to reassure the stakeholders, and people need to understand the risks and be able to judge whether these risks are reasonably managed. You can never eliminate the risk, but you can manage it responsibly. And finally, the ethical soundness and the need to respect the global south and the sovereignty of data, which is similar to what happens in minerals. Thank you very much. So this is the end of the presentation, and I hope I have been able to convey to you the similarities and differences between data and minerals, and I hope that some of the